Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. On behalf of the Tampa Bay Super Bowl 55 Host Committee and our partners at NFL Inspire Change, we welcome you to our first ever Huddle for Change. Huddle for Change is a six-part series of community-wide conversations that highlight the systemic injustices that exist in Tampa Bay and change the way we talk about them. You, the brilliant activists, community organizers, nonprofit, business, and civic leaders will create solutions to transform our community. Back in June of 2020, which honestly feels like ages ago, the world was deeply affected by the tragic murder of George Floyd. Like many others, our host committee immediately began to explore ways we could leverage our platform to highlight the injustices that exist in our community that often lead to tragedy, despair, and hopelessness. We agreed that to truly spark change, we needed to be intentional. So we added a sixth pillar alongside the five that already existed to our Forever 55 social legacy program, which addresses the most critical needs in our community. But we did more than give it a cool name and an awesome logo. We developed an intentional strategic plan to focus on critical areas where systemic injustices are most prevalent and put real dollars behind that plan. Because what we know is if there is no money, there is no mission. To celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the impact he had on advancing the civil rights of all people, we honor him today by continuing his legacy to ensure we are doing all that we can to create a more equitable community and world. When we thought about organizations that aligned with the goals of the host committee's systemic justice pillar that could lead us in facilitating what can often be uncomfortable conversations, we immediately thought of Community Tampa Bay. Led by Chief Executive Officer Tammy Bryant Spratling, Community Tampa Bay envisions a community free from discrimination where every individual is treated with dignity and respect. They are pioneers of change through dialogue and cross-cultural interaction. They also cultivate leaders on how to do the same. I'd also like to take a moment and recognize University of South Florida, who is serving as our academic partner, and the Tampa Bay Partnership, who is serving as our data partner for all of these events. So rest assured, we are in good hands. For the next 2 hours, Community Tampa Bay and all of our partners will lead us through various activities. We will explore data that illustrates where we are and how our community perceives race and equity. We'll hear from a panel of local activists who will share their experiences, and then we'll move to breakout sessions that give you an opportunity to not only share your story, but listen to the stories of others. Finally, we will come back together to uncover those aha moments that emerged in your breakout sessions. Without further ado, I introduce you to Tammy Bryant Spratling.
Thank you so much, LaKendria, and good afternoon, everyone. We are so pleased at the overwhelming response we received from today's event and the six-part series. Now is a time for difficult dialogue across differences, whether physical or philosophical. While technology has advanced humanity exponentially, it has also served to reinforce ideas that we agree with and to isolate us from ideas that we disagree with. That is a dangerous threat to our democracy and provides no path towards an inclusive community, whether we define community locally, nationally, or globally. Therefore, events such as today that bring together community members to talk and interact on a personal level are essential to building a better, more equitable existence for all. Community Tampa Bay envisions a community free from all forms of discrimination, where every individual is treated with dignity and respect with regard to their race, ethnicity, nationality, sex, gender, sexual orientation, class, ability, faith, and/or age. We have been creating space for anti-discrimination work as a nonprofit in the Tampa Bay area since the 1940s under different names. We became Community Tampa Bay in 2005, reinforcing our commitment to the Tampa Bay area. We believe that cross-cultural connection and dialogue is essential in breaking down the biases, prejudices, and stereotypes that contribute to systemic racism and discrimination. Therefore, our mission is to cultivate inclusive leaders to change communities through dialogue and cross-cultural interaction. In other words, we empower people with the tools to have hard conversations with others who don't look like them, live like them, or love like them, to create a community free from all forms of discrimination. Our programs train and cultivate individuals who make a difference in institutions and communities by influencing others through dialogue and cross-cultural interaction. We believe we can effect positive change when we have leaders across identities who influence culture and interrupt systemic institutional discrimination through personal relationships, advocacy, and representation. Therefore, it was our great honor to be selected as the Super Bowl host committee's partner for the Huddle for Change initiative. We have a unique opportunity here to bring people across the Tampa Bay community together to engage in conversations about individual experiences aligned with the data provided by the Tampa Bay Partnership. So today's program and the future 5 sessions will empower all participants to share their experiences and perspectives. We specifically have developed an interactive and facilitated program to encourage connection. Our learning objectives do not stop there though. We will take our shared conversations and develop out our next steps we believe can eradicate racial inequalities in the Tampa Bay area. At the end of this series, we envision having a set of solutions for moving forward. Each of the 5 sessions will be topic-driven. We will look at the ways community members experience racial inequalities surrounding wealth, education, mental health, physical health and wellness, and the criminal justice system. For each community conversation, we will use the data provided by the Tampa Bay Partnership as a starting point. We will also have a partner who's a subject matter expert that's already engaging in the work in our community. Now, moving forward with the next part of our program, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Elizabeth Horch Freeman from University of South Florida and Dave Sobish from the Tampa Bay Partnership. Dr. Elizabeth Horch Freeman is an associate professor of sociology at the University of South Florida and senior advisor to the president and provost for diversity and inclusion. She is an accomplished author with several books, including The Color of Love, Racial Features, Stigma, and Socialization in Black Resilient Families. This is an award-winning book, which was also the topic of our 2015 TED Talk. A Fulbright scholar to Brazil, Dr. Horch Freeman recently completed a new book entitled Second-Class Daughters, Informal Adoptions as Modern Slavery in Brazil. In her newly launched YouTube channel, Sweeter the Juice, she uses a casual and humorous approach to engage in discussions and issues related to racism and colorism, which are intended to be accessible and empowering. Welcome, Dr. Horch Freeman. Dave Sobish joined the Tampa Bay Partnership in December of 2015. He brought with him nearly 2 decades of economic development research and project management experience. In his role, he leverages a career of project management, management of outside consultants, data analysis, planning and reporting, coordination with outside agencies, and development and implementation of recommendations to enhance prosperity and economic competitiveness throughout the Tampa Bay region. As a business development manager for Pinellas County Economic Development, he oversaw the high-profile retention of a Fortune 200 headquarters. Dave is a certified economic developer with an MBA from USF and a master's MBA from the University of Florida. And he has been active with the International Economic Development Council, the Florida Economic Development Council, and the National Association for Business Economics. Now I'm pleased to turn it over to Dave, who will give an overview of the data we will be using as a foundation and framework for our conversation. Dr. Horch Freeman will then follow up with a panel discussion of community leaders to talk about their personal experiences as reflected in the data.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Tammy, for that very kind introduction. I'm very honored to be speaking with you this afternoon and sharing some of the results from the Tampa Bay Racial Sentiment Survey released last fall. The partnership produced this survey as part of our State of the Region collaborative in conjunction with the Community Foundation of Tampa Bay, United Way Suncoast, and the USF Muma College of Business. First, just a little bit of background. After the murder of George Floyd and the protests that took place in Tampa Bay and across the country this summer, the Tampa Bay Partnership started to think about how a group of business leaders could respond to and impact issues of race and racism. Our first instinct as an organization is always to try to quantify the issue as much as possible before we identify a path forward. And so we wanted to explore and to understand the feelings and perceptions our residents have about race and racism in Tampa Bay. We engaged a researcher to conduct a scientific poll, the Tampa Bay Racial Sentiment Survey, that probes deeply into how our residents perceive themselves and each other in the context of race. We found a lot of areas where the experiences of the region's Black and white residents are radically different. As our pollster put it, it's one community, but in many ways, two completely different worlds. So just a quick note about our methodology. This was an online survey of 450 Tampa Bay residents. And in this survey, we defined Tampa Bay as Hillsborough, Pinellas, Pasco, and Hernando counties. All responses were weighted to ensure demographic representation of the region. We did oversample Black and African American residents to ensure we had really good data to compare and contrast the responses of our Black and white residents. And while we did not oversample residents of Hispanic or Latinx ethnicity, as we go through the slides, I'll point out where there were some statistically significant findings for that demographic group. As we go through the findings, remember that we are measuring personal sentiments or perceptions of our residents. While perceptions may be factually incorrect, they are never wrong. So please use the chat for questions, and I'll be available in other parts of the program to provide clarifications. Let's dive right in. We asked residents whether they feel race relations in the United States are generally good or generally bad. While the majority of both Black and white residents feel U.S. race relations are generally bad, more than 80% of Black residents feel they are generally bad, compared to less than 70% of white residents. Overall, Black and white residents agree race relations are getting worse, but a larger share of white residents are more likely to think they are improving relative to Black residents. So the same questions with a local focus. And here, Black and white residents feel things are generally good, although white residents are much more likely to feel that way. Note here that Hispanic Latinx residents fall somewhere in between the perceptions of white and Black residents. Are race relations improving? White residents are more likely to think so, although a majority of both Black and white residents feel things are staying the same. We asked a series of questions asking residents the extent to which issues of race or ethnicity shape dialogue in the community and one's own identity. We asked the question, how much attention is being paid to race and racial issues in your community these days? Nearly twice as many Black residents felt too little attention is being paid. We note on this question that Hispanic Latinx residents aligned with the perceptions of white residents. 34% of each group felt too little attention was being paid. This is one of the more significant findings in the survey. Asked the question, how important is your race or ethnicity when it comes to your personal identity? 71% of Black residents feel it is extremely important. While no response captured a majority of white resident sentiment, a plurality of white residents felt their race is not important to their identity. And we note on this question that Hispanic Latinx residents aligned more closely with Black residents. As a plurality, 45% of this group felt their ethnicity is extremely important to their identity. Asked about the frequency with which friends or family members make racially insensitive comments or jokes, 58%, which is the 44 plus 14, of Black residents said rarely or never, compared to 73%, 40 plus 33, of white residents. 75% of Black residents feel that the expression of racist or racially insensitive views has become more common over the years. White resident perception is equally divided as to more or less common. When asked if it's become more or less acceptable for people to express racist or racially insensitive views in recent years, a majority of white residents feel it has become less acceptable, whereas a plurality, 47%, of Black residents feel it has become more acceptable. And we note on this question that Hispanic Latinx residents aligned more closely with white residents. As a majority, 56% of this group felt expressing these types of views has become less acceptable. We also asked a series of questions regarding the role of racism in society. While Black and white residents alike agree that white supremacist hate groups pose a threat to America, there was a sharp difference, and take a look at the bottom of the chart, regarding the legacy of slavery in the current social and economic position of Black people. There is agreement between Black and white residents in the perception that Black people are treated less fairly by the criminal justice system, but in other areas, the perception of fair treatment was not shared. Black and white residents disagree on the impact of being white on the ability to get ahead. 56% of Black residents feel it helps a lot, in contrast to only 22% of white residents feeling that way. In the case of being Black, 2 in 3 Black residents feel it hurts a lot or a little in getting ahead in our community, compared to 51% of white residents. Here's that same question, as answered by all residents, presented in side-by-side format. In the top bar, we see that 54%, 25 plus 29, of all residents feel that being Black hurts one's ability to get ahead. In the bottom bar, we see that only 14%, 7 and 7, of residents feel that being white has the same impact. For respondents who stated that being Black either hurts a lot or a little, but hurts in some way in getting ahead, large majorities agree that both systemic and individual racism are the leading causes. Finally, we asked some questions about individual experiences with racism. In response to the question, have you personally experienced discrimination or been treated unfairly because of your race or ethnicity? We clearly see a parallel divide between Black and white residents. While 80% of Black residents responded yes to that question, nearly 80% of white residents responded no to that question. And we note here that on this question, Hispanic Latinx resident experiences fell in between the white and Black experiences, that a majority, 60%, of these residents have personally experienced discrimination. Among those who said they had experienced racial discrimination, racial slurs or jokes were the most common form for both Black and white residents. Black residents were far more likely to report unfair treatment in hiring or employment, that people treat them as not being smart, and that people acted suspicious of them. I've got a couple summary slides in here. In the interest of time, I'll leave these for you to review at your convenience. I know that was a lot of information to cover in a short time, and I thank you for your attention. The survey results are available at stateoftheregion.com under other resources, and I'll look forward to being part of this discussion today and into the future.
Thank you very much, David, for that informative presentation and really that thorough overview of how residents of the Tampa Bay region view and understand racism today. So clearly, the data suggests that there are significant gaps in terms of how Blacks, whites, and Hispanics of all races perceive racism. And so this gap may be attributed to a number of factors. And one of those reasons may be the difficulties in really recognizing the wide-reaching ways that systemic and individual forms of racism impact communities of color. So in this panel, I am pleased to have the opportunity to connect these broader data trends with insights from people's everyday lives and their lived experiences in order to really enlighten the community about the very personal ways that systemic racism is felt by our panelists and in ways that illustrates that systemic racism is real. So with that goal in mind, we are honored to have two guests joining us on this panel. First, we have Mr. Ed Narain, who is a community leader, former member of the Florida House of Representatives representing District 61, and I should mention, former president of the student body at the University of South Florida from 1997 until 1998. We also have joining with us Mr. KJ Sales. KJ is a current University of South Florida student athlete and community activist. So thank you both for joining us here today. So really, without further ado, I want to go ahead and get started so we have ample time to hear both KJ's and Ed's perspectives on the study and on racism more broadly. And so my first question is really to Mr. Ed Narain. And I want to frame this by saying that the data that was just presented shows that Tampa Bay residents view race relations in their own community more positively than they view race relations in the US more broadly. So why do you think people see racism as something outside of themselves and are not able to see it or recognize it within their own community?
So great question. And first, let me say to everybody involved in asking me to participate in today's Huddle for Change, the first ever, thank you very much for thinking so highly of me to ask me to be here. And yes, I am a proud Bull. I am also very proud to be associated with the Tampa Bay Partnership, representing my company on its board. So very proud of the work that the partnership has been doing in this particular area. But what you find is a lot of times people don't believe there's a problem because they're not directly affected by it. Let's take a couple steps back and look back to the civil rights movement. Because when we think about racism in this country, especially for those of us who are under 50 years old, that's the lens in which we're taught to look at racism. So if we don't see people being hosed down in the streets, if we don't see people being attacked by dogs in Kelly Ingram Park, or having to sit down and protest for their basic rights to sit wherever they want in a public place like a bus, we're led to believe that racism is over. And so I think that's the biggest lie that we've kind of told ourselves as a society, that we've moved past the institutional racism that's out there, the very overt versions of it. And because we don't see it every day and it's not happening, it means that it's completely evaporated. And nothing could be further from the truth. You know, most recently, I think last year when George Floyd was murdered, what that did was that put a mirror up to our country. And when we look back in that mirror, for the first time in a long time, all Americans, we didn't like what we saw because it was raw. And we watch a man get murdered by an institution that's supposed to protect and serve us. And so I think if you took a poll amongst Black Americans, they would tell you, hey, we've been telling you there's an issue with policing in our communities for a long time. Whereas most white Americans, despite what they've seen over the last 7 years with the protests in the streets, would say, oh, no, there's no problem with policing. So that mirror that we had to look at, we saw something that we thought was long gone. And for a lot of Americans, they said, okay, we need to do something. The problem is we didn't know what to do in that moment. So yes, as long as we think that problem is in Minnesota and not Tampa, people are less likely to actually do something to bring about change.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that answer. And I want to ask a follow-up question that I'll also ask to KJ after you. But from your unique position as a community voice, has it gotten easier or harder to talk about racism now in comparison to the past year, for example?
So I will say this. This goes back to what W.E.B. Du Bois talked about, having a dualness, and a two-ness as a Black person in America. I've always had the burden of having to talk about and explain race to my white peers, whether it be in the business world or back when I was serving in government. And it is something that we have to kind of carry with us, African Americans in certain circles, to kind of explain to people who haven't been exposed to African American culture, in particular, in my case, what exactly may be going on or why people may be upset about a particular judicial outcome. So it is something that it's a burden, but it's one that I'm glad to carry, because at least we're conversations like this, those one-on-one conversations that we've had we've seen change start from that. So yes, it is something that lately has become easier to talk about, because the groups that want to talk about race will approach you. This forum being put together is great, but I'm going to say this, and I mean this in the nicest of terms. The people who are on this webinar right now who are listening are not the people who need to change their views on race in America. It's our brothers, it's our cousins, it's those who are around us that don't think race is still an issue that need to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your answer to that. And I want to offer that question also to KJ. KJ, from your perspective, you've actually been pretty vocal. We talked about the fact earlier that you have been on the news and been interviewed in newspapers. How has it gotten easier or harder for you to talk about racism in this moment in comparison to the past? How would you respond to that? I think you might be muted, KJ.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
I think that it has gotten easier due to the simple fact that, a lot of people are starting to become more open to, the situation. And like I said, this has been going on for decades and centuries. And this is something that needs to be talked about. But, I feel that as if people really don't understand, some people just really don't understand, and these conversations, have to be brought up in order for people to understand.
Right. And so it sounds like you feel like this is a context where people are actually open to hearing this. I want to pivot a little bit to talking, and this question is for you actually, KJ, to talk a bit about the study in particular, because some folks may have the impression that if you go to college, once right. Black people in particular have an education, once they are a representative for Florida, for example, in the House, that they no longer have to deal with racism, that they don't have to face racism. From your experience, do you believe that is true? Why or why not? Does your class status or your status related to your occupation allow you to escape racism?
To a certain extent, in my opinion. Once you've went to college, once you're an athlete or, you have your celebrity, that's all good and well until you don't have that anymore. And I feel as if, once you hang up your cleats or once you stop dribbling a basketball or once you graduate from college, it becomes a problem when people don't know who you are or when you're in this unfamiliar area where there isn't anyone that really knows who you are. And so that's when you start to experience, that's when, people like me, LeBron and others start to experience that type of racism.
What's interesting, is that, there's a whole conversation about a conversation about athletes not needing to speak about injustice. So the idea is just, shut up and dribble or shut up and play. So it's almost as though athletes can get the space to play, but the moment they try to use their position in a way to advance justice, there's been pushback. So it's interesting that you take that position. I want to direct a question to Mr. Narain. One of the interesting findings in the study is that while white residents readily acknowledge racism in policing, they were less likely to say that it exists systemically in education and the financial wealth gaps and job attainment. What do your own experiences lead you to believe about whether or not racism is a systemic problem?
My own experiences with that. There's a story that I've actually become more comfortable telling lately that I hadn't told for a long time about the first night that I got elected in Tallahassee. And I was there with another member of the legislature. We had a drink at a Hotel Duval. We came downstairs. We ran into a couple other members. One of those members was white. And that white member looked at both of us. And he said, "Hey, who do you guys work for?" Now, granted, we were new, right? So somebody would say, "Ed, you're making too much of this. The guy, he shouldn't have known who you were." The problem was the person who asked this question was another member who a week earlier had done our training on how to be members of the House of Representatives in Florida. So this wasn't a simple, mistake. We're both wearing our pins that reflect us as being members of the legislature, but in his mind, he could not see us as actually being members or his equal. We had to be aides. We had to be somebody working for somebody. And it's those type of microaggressions that African Americans and Latinos in this country have to deal with when we're around some of our peers. We're never really seen or accepted, unfortunately, as equals. And you're in this constant state of trying to almost prove yourself and prove your worth. And I will tell you, that's an imposter syndrome type of situation that I would encourage anybody to try, just get rid of it. If you've made it into that room, you have an obligation to yourself and to your community to be the very best, and forget about those microaggressions, forget about the racism and what people might be thinking about you. All that matters is you did more than enough, and usually in our cases, way more than enough to be there, and it's time to make an impact.
Great, thank you for that. KJ, this is a question that in some ways is in line, in some ways with what Mr. Narain just mentioned. There's sometimes an assumption that Black people already know the history and the impact of systemic racism, and it's white people who need to be educated, or it's other folks who need to be educated. From your experience, how do you think these community conversations or a focus on education might benefit members of all racial and ethnic groups?
I'm glad you asked that question because, my goal for the future is to rebuild. And, a lot of people through experience don't really know what, Black people and minorities go through, and a lot of times it starts in the household. And so, me growing up where I grew up, and it creates this environment to where it's a very competitive environment. But, coming from the bottom, it seems like no one cares about you, or no one wants to see you win, or you have all odds against you. And a lot of times, we see these young men, brought up in society today, their minds are gone because they feel like no one cares about them, or no one cares about their place of living, and no one cares about, their schooling and things like that. So I feel as if, rebuilding and educating people on how, these people are living, some of these living situations are just flat out terrible, and it needs to be rebuilt. For example, Central Park Villages, where I grew up, it was the projects, of course, and it's tore down now. It got tore down in 2007, but that was a place of living back in the day for African Americans that was considered, the Black Wall Street of Tampa. And of course, it got torn down because of all the riots. But to see how that project progressed over the years, the living situation wasn't what it used to be. It was infested, it was rats, it was everything like that. So no one had the chance to, no one even thought, oh, let's go over here and let's try to help these people, revamp their life or their situations and things like that. So I think that plays a key part into it.
Right. And so it sounds like what you're saying is that education piece is important for all communities, whether we're talking about Black folks, white folks, Hispanics of all races. Everybody needs to have a clear understanding of the history that's led us to where we are today. And we can't assume that people know that. I know we have a limited amount of time on our panel, and as we wind things down, one of my final questions is actually for Mr. Narain, which is, what do you think we can do as a community to be sure that anti-racism is not just a phase, but instead is really incorporated and embedded into our policies and our practices? And how might conversations like these be useful in that to reach that goal?
Well, obviously, what the community is doing today through all the partnerships that have come together to make this forum happen is one of the first steps that it needs to occur. The other thing I'll share is it's incumbent upon everybody. Going back to the very first question, about why don't we see racism as a local problem or a problem for each of us? We all have to take responsibility in trying to educate those who may not understand truly why people are in the situation that they are in, for example, which is why I love the data that the partnership has just come out with. I mean, if we think about the data, there was some striking things that jumped out at me. I'll give you one of the examples. African Americans make about $4.48 less per hour than white Americans right here in Tampa Bay. Now, we're not talking about Mississippi or Alabama. We're talking about an income gap that's right here. And if you were to resolve that issue, if we were to just wipe a wand over Tampa Bay and make it equitable for Black and brown people, according to the study, you're looking at a $50 billion impact to this community, $50 billion with a B. That's an average of $6,500 per capita income per household. That's how you lift people out of poverty. There's a cycle that has happened. Let's not forget the laws and the systemic racism that put most Black and brown people in the economic situation that we're in today. Those have changed, okay? There's no doubt about it. What needs to continue to change is people's hearts. And so that means if you're serving on a board that's not diverse, you need to speak up and ask about why we don't have more people of color at the table. Same thing for your corporations. Yes, it's good to have entry-level positions that look like the country, but what about your senior leadership? Why don't we have more African-American and Latino executives serving on boards and leading corporations? It starts with each of us. And then finally, I'll say it's on our government leaders to make sure that when they're passing policies, they're thinking about all the unintended consequences of those policies and how it might impact people. Thank goodness Florida has raised the minimum wage effective this year, but that minimum wage is only $8.56 an hour. So you do that by 40 hours a week, by 4 weeks in a month, you're talking an average of a little over $16,000 a year for an individual. Guess what? That's only $4,000 above the poverty line for a single person. So we have to look at, how did we get here? Why is it that Black and brown people are only seen to be accepted in certain positions outside of entertainment? So I'm not talking about just music or athletes, but when you think about professionals, why don't we have more Black doctors, more Black attorneys, more Black business people? We have to ask those questions. And then if you are white, you need to patronize those individuals with your services. Because I can tell you this, if you took a poll of most of your professionals and you asked them whether or not people that didn't look like them utilize their services, I don't think you'd be surprised by the answer. The answer is no. So we've got to be intentional about who we give our business to and the policies that we're passing in government. And then those of us who have positions of influencing it, using it to make sure we're diversifying the situations that we find ourselves in, whether it be a board or some sort of government service or some sort of corporate work. Long answer to a very complicated question, I know.
Well, I appreciate your thoughtful response. I think essentially what you're saying is that any of these solutions have to be multidimensional. We have to understand the multidimensional impact of systemic racism. So we're talking about diversity in terms of recruitment, but we're also talking about advancement. We're talking about changing policies and practices. And it really is that type of multi-layered approach that's going to be required. So I'd just like to thank both of you, Mr. KJ Sales, Mr. Ed Narain, for participating on this panel and for really modeling the type of vulnerability with your own personal stories that we hope we'll also see in the break room a little bit later on today. So thank you so much. And I believe that your answers have given us a better sense of understanding of some of the issues that you two individually face, and will hopefully set the stage for future conversations with the broader community about how to address systemic racism. And so with that, I'll pass this back to Tammy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horace Freeman, and I join you in thanking the rest of the panel as well. What I love about your comments this afternoon is that we have the connection of the data to the personal experiences, and then the reminders from our panelists. Mr. Narain, I was hearing you when you were saying that sometimes the people that are coming to these programs are the ones that are kind of the furthest down the road in terms of our journey to racial understanding. And so we have to talk to our family, our cousins, our community members, wherever we find them, and ensure that we're utilizing that history as the foundation for our conversation. So today, we've built out kind of true frameworks for you already. We have the data to support it, and we've started to talk about the history. And so now we're going to build up some skills around being able to have conversations, difficult conversations around race equity from an informed and empowered and confident position. So I'm so grateful for this opportunity, and we're going to take what we've learned now and move into breakout rooms. But before we do that, I'm going to introduce my Community Tampa Bay colleague, Sam Obeid. And Sam's going to walk us through an activity to build the connection and mutual understandings that we need to engage in those difficult and uncomfortable conversations, right? Because we're always looking for safety, but we know we're also going to be uncomfortable. So Sam is Community Tampa Bay's program director. She's a social justice activist by life, and Sam speaks to topics of identity and intersectionality. She prides herself on being a compassionate human invested in the development of both youth and adult advocates. Sam is also an internationally renowned spoken word poet, and believes that open dialogue is the key to bridging gaps between communities. Sam?
All right, wonderful. So good evening, folks. Thank you all so much for being here. Like Tammy said, I am the program director of Community Tampa Bay. And at Community Tampa Bay, we prioritize the safety of all of our humans before we engage in dialogue. So for this next portion, I'm going to ask y'all to please use the power of your imagination, all right? You can close your eyes if you have to. And in your mind, I'm going to ask you to imagine 4 corners of a room, right? So you're imagining 4 corners of a room. Now, each corner has a label. One corner is family. One corner is friends. One corner is school or work. And the last corner is miscellaneous. So you have family, friends, school or work, and miscellaneous. The miscellaneous corner is any group outside of family, friends, school / work. So this could be a church, mosque, temple, synagogue group that you are a part of, or any other religious group that you are a part of. It could be a sports club. It could be a book club, any other group that does not fit into these other 3 labels, okay? So you're gonna imagine those 4 corners in your mind. Now my question for you is, in which of these 4 corners do you feel the safest? All right? In which of these 4 corners do you feel the safest? Take a few seconds to pick a corner. Now in the chat box, you are going to type in 1 word as your reason for picking why you feel safest in this corner. So for example, let's say if my corner was friends, if the corner that I feel safest in is friends, then the reason for that would be because that's where I feel like I can be my most authentic self. So my word would be authentic, right? So take a second. We already have some folks responding, which is fantastic. Take a second to figure out why you feel that way and go ahead and type it in the chat box like so many of our lovely humans are already doing. Seeing a lot of the word love is coming up a lot, trust, honesty. There's a lot of energy around acceptance, safety. I'm seeing genuineness, room for mistakes. We have understanding, familiarity, a lot more trust, a lot more safety, a lot more authenticity, lots of love, lots of acceptance. We're seeing listening quite a few times, lots of understanding. I have love, 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 love across the board, choice, unconditional love. Okay, so we're seeing a lot of energy around the words love. We're seeing a lot of energy around the words trust. We're seeing a lot of energy around the words support, right? We're seeing a lot of energy around the words authentic or genuine. Yes, we're seeing a lot of words around, a lot of energy around understanding, listening, faith, to love without fear. Again, support, so much support and so much love, lots of empathy, lots of compassion, right? So we have all of these words. Clearly, there's a lot of energy around feeling safe enough to be authentic and genuine, feeling safe enough to be loved and to feel that love, feeling empathized with, feeling a lot of compassion in spaces, feeling accepted in spaces. Okay, so these are the words that are drawing the most energy among the folks that are here today. Now, when we will be breaking out into small groups shortly, when we do, I'm going to ask you all to remember these words. Because when we're having conversations, especially around race, we want to feel a sense of safety to be able to have those conversations. And if folks have an expectation of love and empathy and support and compassion and authenticity in order for them to feel safe, these are the norms that we are then going to take into those spaces, into those breakout groups, to ensure that we can, in fact, have an open and honest conversation. You can see the words up on the screen for yourself, right? Those are all the words that are drawing most energy from our folks here this evening. And so what we are going to do is each group, each breakout group that we go into is going to have a designated facilitator, and this designated facilitator is going to lead you through a series of questions around which you'll have the capacity to have a conversation. They will give you further direction as you go into this conversation, right? So our motivation right now is to remember these words as we go into those conversations, because we want everybody here who's participating to feel safe, to feel seen, and to feel heard in everything that they're sharing with us today. Facilitators, please make sure that you reiterate our norms as you lead these conversations. And now, without further ado, let's head out into our breakout rooms. Fam, as you find yourselves waiting in your breakout room, rest assured that your facilitator will meet you there shortly and help guide this conversation through.
Hey everyone, it looks like you're all coming back from your breakout rooms, and we're all joining back into this one community as one big group. And I hope that you all had meaningful conversations and were able to begin envisioning some solutions based on the data and connecting that data to your personal experiences. Of course, this is only our first time together, so we will be able to have more conversations like these over the next 5 sessions. We invite you to attend any session in the future that addresses a topic of interest, or you can attend all 5 sessions. Unfortunately, earlier we had a bit of a technical error and we lost Claire Lessinger, but she's back with us now and is going to share her thoughts and her welcome remarks.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yes, sorry for the technical difficulties at the beginning. Troubleshooting, problem solving, and contingency planning is definitely part of our team's daily routine these days. So I'm going to flip my open to the close and roll with it like it was meant to be. I do want to thank you all for joining us for this dynamic, necessary conversation on such an important day. Thanks to the speakers and the facilitators for being leaders and change agents, for sharing your voice, your experiences, your expertise with our audience. I'm so grateful to have listened and learned from you today. Boy, do we have work to do, and it starts with conversations like this. As our community prepares to host its 5th Super Bowl, we have a tremendous opportunity and responsibility to leverage this global platform and to help inspire change and help transform lives. There's no doubt that this will be somewhat of a non-traditional Super Bowl, but for our community, it's arguably the most important Super Bowl of our time, given the current climate and times. The host committee and the NFL and many community partners are committed to collaborating and being a part of the solution here in Tampa Bay. As Lakendria mentioned earlier, Forever 55, our primary legacy program in partnership with the NFL, is a $2 million commitment focused on 6 pillars. Those pillars represent identified needs in our community, and those needs are at an all-time high due to the pandemic. Today's event is an example of how Forever 55 can help be a catalyst for change and help move the needle in propelling our community forward forever together. We look so forward to hosting you and many others in more conversations, events, forums, outings, initiatives just like this to help bridge gaps, unify our community, and ultimately leave a lasting impact. So thank you all so much. We so appreciate you joining us.
Now we are going to turn toward outlining our collective solutions and report any aha moments or notes that occurred during our breakout groups. I'm going to call on each of the facilitators to report out a summary of their discussion, and we're going to be taking notes so that we can build those as our next steps as we begin to move forward with the other parts of our series. As we report out, please consider these 3 questions and provide any answers that you might have in the chat. The first question, what are the next steps forward for our community? That is, what are the next steps forward for our community? Number 2, which critical voices and perspectives need to be included in the conversation? That is, number 2, which critical voices and perspectives need to be included in the conversation? And then finally, what types of issues and themes need to be addressed in the upcoming session? Again, that is number 3, what types of issues and themes need to be addressed in the upcoming session? So again, as we hear from the facilitators as they share out their aha moments, consider these 3 questions and provide any thoughts that you might have in the chat.
Okay, well, we had a very good conversation. We addressed all 3 questions very quickly. On the first question from the report, one of the things that we talked about was that we were all surprised, or the people who addressed it talked about being really surprised by how strong some of the differences were. One group member talked about noticing that where in one of the responses where 80% of the blacks saw a problem, 80% of the whites didn't. And so we were struck by the differences. We were also struck by differences where in terms of police, where Black people were more likely to see police as a threat, where just the opposite, white people would see police as a source of safety and protection. On the third question, did views change? Yes, we had one of our respondents say, yes, they changed. They changed significantly, with the murder of George Floyd, learning from what the Black Lives Movement was doing, that was very powerful. But coming back to the second question, why we have differences in, why people didn't recognize differences in other areas outside of policing, we had a couple of people who work in the Tampa Bay area and who talked about, were more solution oriented. And one of the solutions they talked about was we need to readdress the idea of skills-based hiring, and that we need to look at the requirements that we ask people to have when they apply for jobs and really question, are all the skills needed? For example, do we really need to have a college degree on all of those? And then another person used the language looking at transferable skills. When we're hiring people, we have a set of skills. Instead of saying you have to meet a skill exactly, look at another set of skills and to see if they're transferable. So those were some of the things that we said in our group.
Wow, Dr. James, those are incredible kind of aha moments that your group came up with. I definitely love the transferable skills and really looking at ways that we can get more people to work in our community so that they can build sustainable lives. So I think that was incredible for your group to create those sorts of links to their experiences and the data. Thank you. Next, we're going to go to Montelio. Do you want to report out briefly?
Yeah, for sure. So in our group, we really talked about some surprising things. The biggest surprise being the comparison of Latinx to the Black experience. And from there, I think the biggest aha moment was one of our group members talks about their observation of how there's a disconnect in terms of how Black people feel and what white people believe that Black people feel. And so then the conversation kind of veered off from there to go into examples of what that looks like, based upon some of the recent situations that have happened in the last couple of months, and really kind of talking about upbringings and family, and we kind of also veered off into geographical areas, the state and Midwestern versus like moving to the Tampa area. So really great conversation. And I mean, we cut it short, but we had to we almost want to keep going.
Well, I mean, similar to Dr. James, I mean, those were incredible kind of revelations and really looking at, the perceptions of what Black people feel versus those of what, their white counterparts think they feel. I think, these conversations, these events will really help kind of unpack some of that. So thank you so much for your hard work in that. All right, next up, we've got Dr. Sears.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My group was really enlightening when they reflected on this lack of consciousness relative to the awareness of the impact of slavery in the Black community. And it was asserted that have persons not been tracking the activities relative to Reformation or arguments relative to generation wealth and its implication. And one of the recommendations that was really noteworthy was the implication of the community college that bridges the high school to college to the university, where we actually recruit, retain, and sustain diverse representation. And then it also talks about equitable opportunities. And that settled because it talked about systemic equity in regards to your wealth, to your education, and to your health. And there was also mention of soft skills, where we consider, what it takes not just to get the job, but also to keep the job. It was acknowledged that the Black Lives Matter movement, the perspectives can vary pending your intersectionality in that space. And so we acknowledge that there was different experiences based on one side of the bridge versus on the other side of the bridge. And really thinking about how can we educate the masses in a systemic fashion. So one of the persons noted that they, acknowledged the founders' personal stories and their intersectionality, but they also noticed on television potential tensions relative to this learning process as to how do you navigate this space and support the Black Lives Matter movement or have an awareness and understanding of what it is. So this highlighted need for education in a systemic fashion that promotes inclusion and equity holistically.
Wow, that's great. I'm just surprised at all of the different things that you guys uncovered literally in 20 minutes. And I think it's incredibly important. I think one of the points that stick out to me about your group is maintaining diverse representation from community colleges to the universities and and helping those students transition and maintaining those diversity and even increasing diversity in universities. So that was incredible. Thank you so much for your work on that. All right, and next we have Emma.
Hello, thank you. So in our group, we talked about some of the findings that we found surprising versus not as surprising. Some of them that we are not surprised to see is just that the systemic issues do come from a systemic level, these racial issues. We see them shared from the experiences that were talked about earlier in business and education, and we see people in power having those experiences and stuff. So we also had some people share that they were not so surprised by the findings, just because when they go to have conversations with people in their peer groups, they're not very receptive to even having those conversations. They're more closed off to them just because they don't see how it directly impacts them. So it's not as surprising to see some of the differences or to see some of these findings. So So we talked about the value of having conversations and dialogues like this, or having programs like Anytown where people can get that exposure to diverse groups of people, where they feel more comfortable having that dialogue and seeing how their experiences are shaped by programs like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your group really expounded upon and spent some time essentially diving into what at Narain, one of our panelists mentioned earlier, is that a lot of times we have these conversations and people that are in the room don't necessarily need to be in the room because they've already committed to doing the work. And so now it's how do we work together as a community to bring those people who, as you said, don't see how this impacts their life, and show them that so that they too can also commit, or at least be open to doing the work and learning more. So absolutely. Thank you so much. All right. And Danielle is going to be next.
So it was great getting to talk to my group, and some of the highlights. One thing I wanted to mention when it came to the question about what surprised you, I think this is the reality of what one of our panelists had alluded to before, was the idea of like when things don't directly impact you, and what is your role and your understanding of what is it that you need to do as you continue to learn. I think we came with a general understanding by the time we got to the end of our conversation of this importance of continuing to learn and understanding in order to act. Because if you do not have direct experience, you are not going to be as motivated or understand the need to be a part of this process. And we also got into a lot of the conversation of general and global anti-Blackness that comes to be real on our community level, and how, as we talk about addressing systemic issues, though we might be able to more readily point out the systemic issues with policing, but not so much with education and not so much in business, how if we are going to talk about, and as we talk about the needs for systemic change in each of those institutions, really honing in on this idea of anti-Blackness being so prevalent. And as we address that, that would give us a greater benefit to groups with that falls within all of the categories.
Absolutely. I'm sitting here and I'm listening to you, and I feel like we should have saved you last, because literally you just provided the perfect segue into why, the host committee and Community Tampa Bay and our partners have really dedicated ourselves to hosting 5 additional events that focus literally on those things. So how do those systemic injustices play out in education, in the healthcare system, in the wealth gap, and those sorts of things? So thank you so much. And I can't wait to see you back in a couple of months to kind of help lead those conversations too. So thank you so much for that. All right, next we have Gabrielle.
Yeah, hi. So we talked along some similar lines, but just to keep it interesting, I'll bring up some of the points that haven't been mentioned yet. One of those being, in my group, we were talking about how love was such a huge response when Sam had brought up these community guidelines and what makes you feel most safe or most accepted or whatever in each corner. Like, what is that? And that answer being love. And my group kind of building off of that, of saying, how can we engage in self-love and empower others to engage in self-love? And then in response to that, recognizing that it almost overflows of when you have love for self, it naturally comes of having love for others, whether that's friends or family, and then eventually moving on to strangers and other people. And how the value of conversation and seeking out experiences of like kinship and solidarity rooted in love kind of allows that to overflow in a way that inspires change. And then in terms of the change itself, we talked a little bit about how from an individual kind of engaging in community conversations such as this one, and then especially linking with community organizations as a way of slowly but surely kind of expanding what it means and getting bigger and bigger. And how I think oftentimes there's so much rhetoric of like, how can I do anything? Like, what can I as an individual do? And then that kind of, it's to address a systemic issue, as big as it might seem, like I can still do a little bit by financially supporting my local community organization, or listening to activists who are speaking about like racial inequity issues, and then telling friends about it, telling family about it, and hopefully expanding more and more and more to then people who have resources, whether financial or just powerful or however else, are able to continue to enact that change.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really love and practice, right? So how do you love and empathize with people in practice? So you love yourself so that you can love and give and support others in your community, whether they look like you or don't. And so I like that your group dove into that a little bit more and talked about it from a more practical level on how can we as individuals help support this movement. So I think that was very important. All right, and next we have Jasmine.
Hi. So my group, we spent some time first just naming systemic racism and the effects of it, how wide-reaching it is, but then we kind of delved into a few different ways we can step in, how we can practice anti-racism work, and how we can affect change. And so the first point was on access and the need to create access in our communities affected by systemic racism. So how do we ensure the resources are available and used? How do we use our own resources to combat systemic issues where we are? Another point was intervention in a very intentional way. So as individuals, making meaningful efforts to directly intervene and ameliorate problems. We see such lack of diversity in our orgs, treating anti-racism as a practice, as we mentioned earlier, and also leaving our comfort zones to actively intervene. It's accepting that it's going to be uncomfortable sometimes. Another great point was bringing up the changing of narrative, how we need to change our narrative to decenter whiteness and censor the experiences and needs of Black people and other POC. And lastly, I think a great point that we wrapped up with was bringing up healing for our communities. How do we practice healing as a part of our solutions? This can be within smaller specific groups and also involve the wider community, but we need to determine how we can approach healing as a part of a more holistic solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love all of those points. I think the intervention piece is, one of the things that we're hoping to see come out of these events, because we can all identify, racism or discriminatory behavior, but how do we as an individual move the needle forward and intervene in a way that is, back to Gabrielle's point, in a loving way where we are trying to help move our community forward. So I absolutely love that. Thank you so much. All right, and next we have Elois.
Hi, I had a great time having the opportunity to speak with my group. We said that a lot of the racial injustices that we are seeing are from systemic issues, and they take place through policy, schooling, and the workforce. But we wanted to make sure that we were having solution-oriented conversations because it is Martin Luther King Day. So some of the solutions that we came up with is through education, training, and transformative dialogue. Which are all of the things that Anytown and Community Tampa Bay are doing. But we said more non-POCs need to work on being comfortable with being uncomfortable. So having those hard conversations when people of color aren't in the room, and holding each other accountable when we aren't in those spaces. And then we said that we need to just have bold leadership. I think my favorite quote from the Breakout group was when one of my group members said, they said that they were talking to their mother and that their mother said, "I love that Martin Luther King had a dream, but someone else needs to have one now." And I completely agree, because now it's time to be more innovative with how we are attacking this movement and how we are attacking the issues that we face day to day. And it also brought me to AOC's quote, which was, "If not now, then when? And if not me, then who?" So we really just wanted to focus on just how we can, in our personal circles, our community circles, and then our work circles, of how we can best take our daily part to implement change.
Awesome. I think one of the things that 2020 taught us, that seems to be carrying over to some degree in 2021, is to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And if there was no other teacher, 2020 definitely taught us that. And so, I'm sure that you've heard, well, we want to go back to normal. To your point, it is time for us as leaders to step up and have a new dream so that we can move our community forward in a very different direction that did not exist, prior to 2020. So you're absolutely right. Great points. Thank you so much to you and your group for working through that. All right. And then we are going to go back to Molly because she started out and we weren't able to hear her. So we definitely want to give you your time to talk about your group and what you guys, what your aha moments were.
So I was actually paired with Dr. Sears, and she has done our share out. So I will just, for the sake of time, throw it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. And I believe we've heard from all of our breakout sessions. Oh, and I'm sorry, we have not. Lena, we don't want to forget about you. Lena, can you share back with us?
Thank y'all. We had a really good conversation with our group, and I'll definitely be echoing a lot of what my fellow peers said here, facilitators, but something that I really wanted to highlight that we heard already said was how our identity and experience let us understand and kind of feel the Black Lives Matter movement, how we're part of the and how we're part of that movement, and most specifically focusing on the anti-Blackness that we're seeing. And something that we really led with in our group, and I'm really humbled that our group was really passionate and kind of built this camaraderie, but we led with experiences in each time. And we had that great conversation of talking about being at a law firm and knowing that, certain people with certain names would feel and be and feel that discrimination because their name wouldn't get past the job board. Or we're talking about being the only Black woman in a boardroom and that experience of having to speak up for themselves. So it really was a conversation of how do we move forward when it's all that we've known, but how do we share that and how do we move forward? And most importantly, one of our group members said is how do we empower ourselves and know ourselves more? And part of that was learning more about the Black Lives Matter movement and its tenets, so we feel most strongly as we kind of go about rallying and fighting for this cause and fighting for it systemically. And I think I forget who mentioned it because everyone here is amazing and everyone was mentioning things, but really thinking about how we can find power in working on this generational work, which our group members stated. So really echoing what everyone said, but again, focusing on how to care for ourselves and healing for ourselves. And even in our group, we had great support of everyone saying, like, I feel for you, I'm thinking about you, as we're sharing these stories and experiences, which I think is really worth it, even if it's via Zoom.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, it goes back sharing those experiences across, various ethnicities and having people understand what your experience is, which is what Montelio said earlier. There's a difference between what Black people feel and what white people think Black people feel. And I think the more that we can have these conversations and share our experiences with those that don't look like us or think like us, we'll be able to develop an empathy within our community that then will be able to transform the way that our community deals with each other. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. All right. And then next we have Tiffany.
Hello. I guess I have the honor of going last and to not echo the sentiments that were already, raised up and lifted. In our group, we did kind of talk about the progression of the movement and, how people felt about it from when the movement started, whether they felt like they had enough information, whether they felt like, they needed to know more, to more recent, getting a lot more of, exposure and see people understanding the need and the urgency for the change that we need to see. It was very enlightening, and it was very eye-opening to see how white people specifically who were in my group saw themselves in the movement and saw themselves and understanding the need and the urgency for having allies, for having genuine allies show up for us, and not, knowing the difference between standing up for us and like taking a step back as well, like knowing that we need to lead the movement, we need the support, but also we need to be the one leading the movement. Some really great conversations. And yeah, that was really it, that to not repeat what the amazing sentiments we've already heard.
Well, Tiffany, you went last, but certainly your perspective and all that your group shared was spot on, and honestly is a perfect way to end this segment, because when you talk about the support that we are now seeing, and white people specifically taking an interest in what those experiences of Black people and other people of color are experiencing, that is what led us to this moment. And it is unfortunate that it took something like the murder of George Floyd to bring us here. But again, if there was ever a time to gain support from the community, from those that haven't already been doing this work, the time is now. And so I really appreciate you and your group for bringing that out and talking about that, because that is literally why we're here today. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think we've had such an incredible dialogue this afternoon. We've been able to connect with one another. We've been able to take this data from the Tampa Bay Partnership Racial Sentiment Survey and connect it to our personal experiences. We've had a ton of themes resonate this afternoon, everything from education to love, to connection, to having conversations powerfully and meaningfully and openly. And so we've just had this really phenomenal conversation that's developed out a lot of suggestions for future solutions. And so when we're moving from today's kickoff event and moving into the rest of the series, I think we have a wonderful foundation of the data as well as the personal connections and solutions to really begin then to drive down into these 5 different issues as we come into each of the future sessions. So I'm really grateful that we've had this opportunity together. And the most important thing for us, I think, is that the substance is really rich and important and meaningful to everyone who's taken the 2 hours to participate this afternoon. So we thank you so much for your commitment and your time. And we've created some polling questions, and I'm hopeful that we are able to get some feedback here and take this information into the future, so that we have this for our next programming and for our planning of that next programming. So the first question that I have is, how satisfied are you with the content of this kickoff session? And I think it's fine if you can just go ahead and click into that. You have 5 different options here: very satisfied, somewhat satisfied, neutral, somewhat dissatisfied, or very dissatisfied. So again, is how satisfied are you with the content of the kickoff session? The second question is, how likely are you to attend a future community conversations related to this initiative? So again, the question is, how likely are you to attend a future community conversations related to this initiative? You've got 5 choices again. Those are very likely, somewhat likely, neutral, somewhat unlikely, and very unlikely. And our final question, this is a really important one for our next planning session, which is, which of the 5 main topics would you like to discuss in our next session together? So we have 5 different options here: education, mental health, wealth gap, criminal justice, and physical health and wellness. So go ahead and select which one you think that we should prioritize and have as our topic for our next session. Excellent. It sounds like we have education and wealth gap leading the responses. So very excited to have next session about either education or the wealth gap. So thank you for that really important feedback. As we are beginning to think about our closeout this afternoon, I just want to say that we're so grateful for your commitment. This is a 2-hour program that was interactive. Our facilitators did a phenomenal job to take a large group of people and get some really good feedback and some really good stories out of that time together, and then come back together, share out, and begin to connect that to your solutions that were typed into the chat. We're going to take all of that information, the data, the chat feedback, the feedback from all of the breakout rooms, and we're going to develop our next part of the series on either education or wealth with all of that in mind, so we can make sure we've built up a strong foundation from this kickoff event and move that into our individual sessions moving forward. We are so inspired that we have this time together and that we can create meaningful movement towards a more equitable and inclusive community. So Lakendra is going to join me back, and she's going to come together. We're going to make sure that we thank all of our speakers and all of our facilitators and all of our participants for your time and investment in today's program. We would also like to thank all of you for your sharing, your vulnerability, and your vision and how we can develop a more equitable Tampa Bay together. So Lakendra is going to join me just now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tammy. Again, on behalf of everyone here at the Super Bowl 55 host committee and our friends at NFL Inspired Change, along with USF and the Tampa Bay Partnership, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We hope that you had a really great time. We look forward to seeing you guys soon.